Graphs are a fascinating data structure because not only are they practically incredibly useful, but they also unlock a really large number of very difficult and interesting math problems. And what's interesting about these problems is that not only are they difficult, but they're easy to state. So there's so many neat problems you can talk about with graphs where you can explain it to somebody, maybe even as young as like 8, and the solution is actually something maybe they can understand, but coming up with the answer is often very tricky. So some examples of those problems. Well, given a graph, is there a path between vertices S and T? Okay, that's a pretty simple one. How about what is the shortest path between vertices S and T? What about a cycle? How do we tell if a graph contains cycles? If I just give you the graph object, and we'll talk about representation soon, how would you know? Is there a cycle or not? How about an Euler tor? This is a cycle that uses every edge exactly one time. How about a Hamilton tor, which is similar, which is not related to the hit musical. God, I couldn't resist that joke. It's just bad. Anyway, you can pretend I didn't say it. Anyway, so Hamilton tor is there a cycle that uses every vertex exactly once? And so these two questions, actually, they seem very similar, but one of them is insanely hard in the sense that writing an algorithm that's efficient is near impossible. The other one turns out to be fairly easy. Connectivity. Is the graph fully connected? That is there a path from any vertex to any other vertex? And for you, I mean, being a primate, you look at a graph and you can kind of see, you could tell whether or not, but for a computer, of course, it's not so obvious because there isn't that immediate, visual cortex thing going on. So with the connectivity, this actually ends up being, slightly more challenging. Not a very hard one. By connectivity, is there some vertex that if you destroy it, the graph is no longer connected? So for example, can I find a subway station that if I eliminate it, there's two distinct subways, some central hub, for example? Another, planarity. This one's actually a very interesting one mathematically. So it's, can you take the graph and draw it on a piece of paper such that no edges are crossing? So there are some graphs such that if you lay out the vertices just right, there's no edges that cross physically, but there's some graphs that actually physically cannot be. Those are non-planar graphs, and this is actually a pretty interesting problem. Isomorphism, this is perhaps the most fascinating mathematically, which is given two graphs, are they actually the same graph? Like maybe you just took the vertices and moved them around. And this has been a long-standing dispute in mathematics, whether or not an algorithm for this has a certain runtime, the optimal algorithm. Okay, and I'm not going to talk about it much on this slide. And so what's interesting about graphs, again, is that these problems are often easy to state, but they can be super hard. And in fact, it's not obvious whether or not they're easy, they're hard, they're actually computationally intractable. So just look at a glance. These different problems, they're all part of a different complexity class is the word. Some are easy, some are hard, some are intractable, and sometimes it's hard to tell. So I think that's a neat feature of graphs, right? If you're somebody who's a little mathematically inclined, there's so much richness here. And if you get involved, for example, in CS theory, one of the many things that this class likes to give hints of what CS is like, graphs are one of the richest areas for theory. So some examples of graphs. Okay, we saw before the Paris Metro. And so with our eyes, we can already see a number of traits. The graph's undirected, and that's easy. You can tell instantly. There's no algorithm for that. You can tell it's connected. And in that case, you would actually need to do some more sophisticated work to see if they're all connected. So as an algorithmic problem, this is non-trivial, but pretty easy. It is cyclic, right? So if we look, there are cycles here. It's not a tree. We can go, for example, we can go here, right? That's a cycle. And it is vertex labeled. In this sense, each vertex has a color, so we can think of that as a label. Okay? And so telling that it's connected or cyclic is actually a computational problem, though both of those are actually pretty easy. How about BART? So the Bay Area Rapid Transit System in the San Francisco Bay Area. Question for you, is it a tree? In other words, are there cycles? Okay, well, we'll notice there is actually one little cycle here, though it's kind of tricky because these edges don't exist at the same time of day, so I guess I would call it a cycle, but maybe you don't because these two edges, they never exist at the same time, at least under these rules. Another example is, this is a very old photo here now, figure from December 2010. But in this case, someone created a neat little graph to show connections between cities. So in other words, if I see an edge from, presumably this is Honolulu to Seattle and so forth, that is the weight of the edge, that is the intensity of each edge, is the number of friends between cities, and the In this figure, then, a bright edge indicates a larger number of friends between those places. It's also kind of interesting because you could see that there are some places in the world that have lots of people that, at least as of 2010, did not have many people on Facebook. So it's kind of cute. You can see this as a neat visualization. Another cool example is this graph of scientific journals. So in this case, each journal, right? So whenever researchers publish work, they spread it to the world by writing it up in a document, sending it out for review by other experts in the field. The other experts decide, okay, that seems above board, and then it goes into a journal, which sometimes they're open access, sometimes you have to pay to access them. And so this is an analysis of all the scientific journals they could get their hands on. And so this node here represents a single journal. In this particular case, this is a journal about the topic social and personality psychology. That is an interesting title. Okay, we have biochemistry, we have toxicology, and so forth. And so each of these has a vertex label. Now, what these edge represent is if you are reading one journal and you decide to click through to another linked article, because often you want to cite other scientific work. If you do that click, it was logged in this case. And so in this case, what the graph tells us is if there were a large number of clicks between this journal and this journal, right? This may be about, so this is an organic chemistry journal, and this is international studies. Interesting that there's a link here. So maybe this was about, manufacturing processes and how they were spread from, let's say, China to Korea, who knows what. And then maybe this article, maybe there was a link to some articles about international studies. So there were enough people clicking on articles in this journal, articles, for example, about that topic I mentioned. And so then once that gets above some threshold, they decide to draw this link. And so we can see here a nice taxonomy of all of science in a way. And we can see this cool arc that we have down here, the life sciences, nicely in green. But they kind of arc into, well, sometimes biology journals will talk about, or say plant agriculture might relate to biotech, which then goes to toxicology, which relates to biochemistry, which then some of those journals are related to analytical chemistry, to organic chemistry, to physical chemistry, to statistical physics, up into material science. So there's this nice, you can see the whole physics to biology sweep. Here we see a bunch of humanities. So we see archaeology, human geography clustered together. I think there's a lot of really neat richness with this figure. And so this, again, what could it be useful for? Well, it's nice because it gives you a picture of the structure of human endeavor. So again, graphs are a very versatile data structure. And you could imagine that those other questions that we discussed before about cycles and so forth, they could be interesting. Maybe, maybe not. Here we could see that pretty much the world of journals is connected, though, to be honest, that's a little bit of an artifact of the fact that these thresholds were chosen, probably precisely so, that it was just barely connected. Okay, that is, suppose they decide the number of clicks that's needed for a connection is only 1, then I bet you every single one of these nodes will be directly connected to every other. Last example I have here is something called Wordnet. This is actually a really cool idea. We mentioned it briefly earlier in a lecture about hyponyms and hypernyms with inheritance. But if we look here, each edge represents that one word is a type of another thing. So for example, variation is a type of change. Change is a type of action. Actions are a type of human activity, which is ultimately an event. Okay? Jumping or leaping, that notion of jumping is a type of increase. An increase is a type of modification, and so forth. So this is a cool database that lets you explore all of the different concepts in English. And I'll mention just briefly that some words belong to multiple concepts. So for example, we have here jump and leap. Here we have jump. So this, jump and parachuting. So this concept is a type of descent, and this type of jumping is a type of increase. And if you want, you can browse this. Now, this lecture is not about Wordnet, so that stuff's not super important. I just thought it was kind of cool. But this graph right here, you can think of each directed edge as representing an is a type of relationship. And again, trying to demonstrate the versatility of graphs.